Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Are you dumb? Are you getting rude to man? That's what you get, fam. Yeah, blood. You come to now, fam. Dickhead.
Wow.
Wow.
Just wow. Not that one. So one of the last updates that the New World team gave us was beyond a few expectations of my own, and I'm pretty sure most people. So let's start chewing our way through this ocean of updates and start talking about the combat. So a good place to start, like always, is probably with the most broad and sweeping changes, as usual, like the XP systems, PvE combat, and stat changes. There were some not so unexpected changes to the XP systems and the rates at which players would gain XP that we kind of already knew was coming, because they'd kind of told us that they bumped it up for the preview event. So as the devs explained, they wanted to give people an idea of what the end game progression would look like, what that kind of content would feel like, and it would also give them in return a wider range of feedback from players to be able to push the game into not just a playable state, but a fun and enjoyable state as well, which I think is a fairly respectable goal to aim for. So they've gone ahead and rebalanced the XP system in a rather interesting way. Between levels 8 and level 60, we actually get a decreased leveling XP requirement by 10% and a decreased weapon mastery XP requirement by 25%. What this actually means is that you need less total experience to level up. Your XP bar is actually smaller than it was before, and there's less numbers flying at you before you get to the next level. But, like I said, the leveling experience is now a larger one, not a smaller one, so there's a trade-off that's kind of coming with this. So PvP missions will be granting you far less XP than they did before. There's diminishing returns on killing creatures that are lower levels than you. More specifically, if a creature is 10 to 19 levels lower than you, you can expect to get 40% less experience from them, and 80% less experience if that creature is 20 or more levels lower than your current character. You can now also expect to get a reduced XP gain from corrupted breaches, creatures in general, and delivery missions, which had a super interesting leveling exploit that all of us most definitely did not use at all to boost our levels as high as possible. Now, my interpretation of this kind of scenario is that they're trying to make leveling a part of the world. They're trying to make leveling an experience for people to go through, instead of it just being some kind of grind fest that you have to get up to a higher level. It seems like they've reduced the total amount of XP you need, but also then further reduced any of the XP you get, so that things aren't as grindy, but you still have to experience the world in order to level up. Honestly though, that's just speculation, and to see how it really works out in the end, we'll just have to wait until the game releases. So alongside these XP changes, we're getting some changes to the skull indicator, which tells you when an enemy outlevels you. It used to be that if a mob was 6+ levels higher than yourself, you would see the skull indicator, but that's now been bumped up to 10+ levels, which might be the New World team attempting to remove some of the level barriers that came into play when grouping with other players, and hinting that you'll have a wider range of mobs to choose from which won't kill you when you're trying to kill them by yourself. If you do end up picking a fight with one of these mobs, you'll have to remember that they have an advantage over your character. So they'll have an increased perception range of 10 meters, so they'll aggro from further away. You cannot stagger them, so there's none of that stun locking you used to be able to get away with in the preview event. They gain both the armor buff of mobs that outlevel you by 3 levels and the damage buff of mobs that outlevel you by 5 levels. And don't just think you'll be able to lie there on the floor, contemplating your life choices in the death door state either. They will outright murder you and force you to respawn elsewhere. Now, it's likely these changes have been made for a few reasons. Primarily, they're trying to stop people from cheesing high-level mobs for bonus XP and loot, and to prevent group hunting and XP boosting in higher-level zones that you shouldn't be in just yet. It's likely also to smooth out some of the gameplay for newer players who might not be as experienced or as greasy as your regular MMO fans. What do you look at me for? So, if a newbie runs into a high-level mob that then smacks them around like they're a red-headed stepchild who just brought their new dad a warm beer, well, that'll deter them from going back to that area until they're of an appropriate level to deal with that mob. So then, along with rebalancing with what you might choose to fight and bumping up the skull level, it's looking like we're getting a very slightly more guided experience, which honestly isn't such a bad thing, especially since they've changed tactic on how this MMO is going to be released. As it's been said a million times before and probably still needs to be said a million times more, this isn't a sandbox MMO anymore. This has got a more theme park experience and there's a lot more lore and story behind the game itself. So guiding the experience probably works towards New World's advantage at this point. It's worked well for MMOs in the past and it's a great way to balance out content and world exploration while leveling. It'll likely also make it easier for the New World team to work on later expansions to the game where further exploration and perhaps leveling is required. So moving on, we should probably take a look at how attributes are being reworked. And oh baby, are those some sexy changes. Right out the gate, we're getting more damage scaling per attribute point in our respective skills, but less base damage coming from weapons. This is going to make speccing more impactful and each attribute point more important when it comes to choosing how you want to play the game, and ensuring you're not that gigabrain one guy who's gone max int build but is wielding a bow and somehow one-shotting everything around you. I'm sure this is most likely also going to lead to a more distinct feel to your chosen playstyle, as points should now begin to affect how you might approach certain fights in both PvE and PvP. You might want to rush in with a higher health count and smash your enemy to pieces, or you might want to stand back, try your best to not get hit and dodge your way out of everything if you've got one of those A+ connections with zero lag that everyone would sacrifice a child for. So Constitution is being tuned, so the percentage increase in health is now equal to the damage increases, so you can't just max tank your way through each and every fight while doing tons of damage using only your base attribute points that you're given when you start the game. You're also being given more attribute points to play with per level. Attribute points are also being added to gear, and there will be diminishing returns being added to all attributes, which is a change that feels like it was pulled right out of Dark Souls, but honestly that's not such a bad thing. Having a soft cap will ensure that people don't just max the most overpowered stat at the time and try and use a meta build. Also, dual attribute weapons now scale differently, so they're comparable to single attribute weapons, which means you should get a little bit more flexibility in how you play a certain hybrid build. So dual attribute weapons work with a primary and a secondary stat scale. Your primary stat scales a weapon at a 90% rate and your secondary stat scales a weapon at a 65% rate. So for example, if you were to go for a sword build, putting a point in strength will scale your damage at 90% effective ratio, and putting a point in dexterity will scale your damage at a 65% effective ratio. This is kind of a nice change from a balance perspective. It'll allow the devs to tune weapons that end up being overpowered very easily without handicapping an entire attribute build or playstyle just because it so happens that the numbers are bumped up really high in one direction or really low in the other direction. And this is the perfect segue into weapons and armor. So that's what we'll take a look at next. The weapons. And the armor. Look, do you want this to be a 5-hour-long video? What do you think this is, a movie? You can get the fuck. So yeah, there's kind of been a ton of changes to the balance here and each different weapon and how they work, as well as a whole bunch of new weapons being added into the game, like the recent Ice Gauntlet announcement. So it's probably going to end up that each weapon is going to need its own specific deep dive, instead of even just making one entire weapon video by itself. So like I said, with absolutely flawless transition, this leads us real smoothly into talking about the changes to the anti-stagger mechanics in the game that are called grit. So yeah, grit and stagger mechanics in the preview event were interesting, to say the least, so I'm glad that's changing. How it works now is that when grit is active, you'll become unstaggerable, and your attacks cannot be interrupted. But keep in mind, that doesn't mean you are unkillable. Most notably, the grit mechanic has actually been removed from a bunch of weapon abilities to stop cheese tactics. It's also been removed from all equip load bonuses, so no more just standing there hulking your way through a fight and never being interrupted at all. You might actually have to think about what you're doing now, to win. Now, if you go ahead and read the patch notes, you're probably going to see a lot of grit removed from this and grit removed from that. And that might have you a little bit worried for when a hatchet boy comes after you. But calm down. It's actually going to be alright. A lot of these stagger effects are being completely removed from certain weapon attacks, and at the very least changed for others. And well, all of those changes I'll just have to cover with each and every successive weapon I do. If I ever get around to it. 75 years from now. But basically, don't worry, your character isn't going to be flopping about like an epileptic in an underground dance club every time you so much as think about being hit. Here's how it works now. PvE enemies cause less interruptions. Light attack spamming doesn't lead to as big of a stun lock problem, proving that there might actually be an existence of a god out there. We used to get a free dodge roll after taking a multi-hit combo. Now on top of that, both basic heavy and light attacks don't cause interruption, and there's a chain attack pattern being added allowing you to string 2 to 3 attacks together depending on the weapon you're using, meaning that you're not going to be interrupted mid-combo. We probably got to see a glimpse of what this looks like when we saw that Rapier Great Axe duel, where the guy with the rapier doesn't take a full interrupt when executing his combo. Now with this heap of updates, we've kind of got a bunch of smaller updates, as is kind of expected with the bulk of content and the bulk of updates that the New World team is just putting out. There's been some very special changes to their design philosophy behind the combat, which is very good to see. So we're going to rush through some of the broader strokes of that here so that this video doesn't take until the end of time. Healers who are using the life staff now get targeted healing for group play, so no more trying to weave your way and your reticle between all these moving attacks while everyone's diving about just to get a heal off. PvE mobs won't be interrupting you nearly as much as before, which really used to break the flow of combat and make things feel like you were in a molasses type system. So now if your ability gets interrupted, you get a cooldown reset, and they say they're not done tuning these systems yet, so there's likely to be more changes implemented. Enemies now have dynamic scaling when it comes to their size, so they're easier to hit for ranged damage dealers when you've got a bunch of people killing a single mob. We're also getting ability queuing with input buffers for more fluid combat actions, meaning that you can input the next ability you want to use just before the ability you're currently using ends. There's also no more global cooldown for your weapon abilities, and all ability cooldowns are now completely separate. Weapon switching is faster, and you will only have 2 weapons to carry around now instead of 3, but arguably better levels of variety and playstyle because of these changes. Finally, the holy grail of action combat, we're getting better hit detection. The game should be launching with less rubber banding issues and less desyncing occurring. And this is just one of those things that they're going to need to constantly iterate on and fine tune, but it's good to know they're working on it as opposed to just ignoring it and pretending it's not happening. So New World has stated that they want their combat to have a high skill cap, be visceral and impactful, with a focus being on what choices you make when fighting your way through the world, as opposed to being slam dunked on by something that has nothing to do with a choice or mistake you made while playing. And from what I can tell and all I'm seeing, we're being led down this path pretty well. I don't see anything that screams game killer to me. Everything so far seems pretty solid and a massive improvement upon what we had to deal with in the preview event. I really feel like New World is beginning to live up to its true potential as opposed to being one of those games that never did. Now keep in mind that everything I've spoken about here isn't everything, and there's surely more to come that we'll have to cover later. But what's important is that all these decisions that are being made aren't just down to internal decisions being made by the devs themselves. A lot of these changes and a lot of these updates have come from the community as suggestions on their forums or through any reporting mechanics they might have, which shockingly enough means that AGS is actually willing to listen to their community, and then even more shockingly, reacting appropriately to any feedback they're given and making adjustments as needed. Now that doesn't mean that everything is going to always be sunshine and roses, and we've already seen that AGS, like any game studio out there, is not infallible and incapable of making big mistakes. But it's a really nice thing when any dev out there is willing to listen to their community and take their feedback. But anyway, that's about it for this video. Big thank you to all my subscribers, new and old. I'm still trying to get over the fact that so many people have subbed recently. And by recently, I mean last month, because it takes me forever to make a video. It's the biggest reason for me to keep making this kind of content, even if I am about as consistent as your old yogurt that's sitting in the back of your fridge. So I'll see you in the next video. Here's your reward meme. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
You. You're finally awake.
I see.